David! David!
1 week earlier, the idea of chasing any man would have insulted Korea's most feared CEO. 7 days later, she'd be running through an airport, begging a struggling Nigerian photographer not to walk out of her life. Hours earlier, every camera in the ballroom was fixed on Korea's most powerful CEO. Hidden among the guests was a struggling Nigerian photographer. By sunrise, he would become the one person she couldn't bear to lose. So that was your plan? Her voice was calm enough to silence the entire ballroom.
You were going to marry me while securing your future with another heiress behind my back?
Her ex-fiancé forced a laugh.
This is high-stakes business. Stop making it personal.
A few board members nodded in agreement. Others looked away. Nobody wanted to offend Korea's most powerful families. They valued profits over compassion, genuinely believing that corporate stability required ruthless sacrifice. Then, disaster struck. Crystal birds shattered across the marble floor. Hundreds of razor-sharp pieces scattered in every direction. Terrified guests stumbled backward, protecting their expensive suits instead of the people around them. Luxury phones rose into the air. Cameras flashed. Within seconds, the charity gala turned into tomorrow's brutal headline. Han Si-hwa didn't move. The 31-year-old CEO of Han Global stood frozen in the middle of the chaos. She stared directly at the man she had almost married. Suddenly, an aggressive push in the crowd sent an antique crystal sculpture tumbling beside the main stage. Crash. The masterpiece exploded into thousands of glittering shards. A little girl screamed as she slipped toward the sharp glass. Nobody reached out. Nobody moved to save her, except one man. A dark-skinned young photographer threw his heavy camera onto a nearby chair and sprinted forward. Before anyone understood the danger, he dropped to one knee, swept the child into his arms, and shielded her from the flying crystal with his own body. The hall fell into a sudden, stunned silence. He gently placed the crying girl beside her trembling mother.
You're safe now.
"You are safe now," he said softly. His breathing was heavy, ragged. Without waiting for a thank you, he began gathering the shattered pieces. One sharp fragment at a time, Si-hwa watched him intently. He wasn't looking at her billionaire status. He wasn't taking photos for a payout. He wasn't trying to impress the elite. He simply continued picking up the broken glass so no one else would get hurt. The arrogant event manager rushed over. "Leave it. The cleaning staff will handle the mess." Young man smiled calmly, though his hand shook slightly. "It will only take me another minute." His Korean carried a smooth, deep, foreign accent. Si-hwa noticed small cuts appearing across his fingers. Crimson blood stained the transparent crystal wings. Without thinking, she walked straight toward him. "You are bleeding." He glanced up. For the absolute first time, their eyes met. Warm brown eyes, gentle, yet carrying a deep, hidden exhaustion, completely unhurried by the chaotic world around them. "It is only a scratch," he replied. Someone whispered loudly from the crowd. "Isn't that the temporary Nigerian photographer they hired for the gala?" Another guest frowned. "A photographer? Then why isn't he capturing the scandal?" Nobody had an answer. Young man stood up, wincing slightly as he shifted his weight. He carefully placed the final crystal bird onto a velvet cloth. As he reached for his camera bag, he noticed something the media missed. Si-hwa's perfect, frozen expression had cracked. Not enough for tears to fall openly. Just enough for a deep, hidden pain to show. She was trapped between corporate survival and raw human vulnerability. Without saying a word, he pulled a soft microfiber cloth from his pocket and held it toward her. "For fingerprints," he said with a small, comforting smile. "But it works for hidden tears, too. If stories where silent kindness transforms broken destinies are your kind of journey, subscribe now, because some beautiful hearts only reveal their true value when they are quietly breaking." Si-hwa stared at the cloth. Her hand hovered in the air, trembling. She wanted to take it, but decades of emotional isolation held her back. She assumed pity. She assumed he had an agenda. No one did anything for free in her world. "Don't need it," she said coldly, pulling her hand away. David's smile dipped slightly, a brief flash of disappointment crossing his features before he quietly put the cloth back. He picked up his camera bag, but the delay had cost him. The event manager was already crossing out his name on a ledger. Because he had stopped to clear the glass instead of shooting the high-profile drama, his agency contract was being terminated on the spot. His kindness had just cost him his primary source of income. Before Siwa could speak, heavy security rushed over to push the media away. When she looked back, the mysterious photographer had completely disappeared into the rain outside. The next morning, Han Global's high-rise executive office buzzed with chaotic damage control. Sculpture is fully insured, ma'am. The shareholders are demanding an immediate explanation. The press has already published 20 articles about the broken engagement. Siwa ignored the paperwork. Her mind kept flashing back to the warm brown eyes that had looked past her title. She looked directly at her personal secretary. Find the photographer. The one from the gala? Yes. We already contacted the agency, CEO Han. They fired him last night for missing the main event photos. They don't know where he lives. He was just a last-minute replacement. Name. The secretary hesitated nervously. The hearing paperwork is incomplete. He simply vanished after the event ended. Silence filled the cold room. This had never happened before. Siwa's corporate instinct flared. She wasn't used to things slipping out of her control. Find him, she commanded sharply. Use every resource. Across the bustling streets of Seoul, David stood behind the wooden counter of a small neighborhood cafe. He wore a simple green apron. Dark circles underlined his eyes. He hadn't slept, spending the night calculatedly balancing his remaining funds. Table 4 needs service, the owner shouted. On it, David replied, adjusting his posture to hide the stiffness in his back. He carried 2 hot coffees toward an elderly woman sitting alone by the frosty window. The woman searched through her faded purse, counting small coins one by one. Her hands shook. Oh dear, she sighed heavily. I am still 501 short. Is completely fine, David said, his voice soft. No, I must go back home. David smiled warmly, subtly sliding one of his own hard-earned coins into the tray. You already paid me yesterday, remember? This one is on the house ledger. Woman blinked in confusion. I did, he nodded firmly. Yes, ma'am, enjoy your coffee. She smiled with immense relief. Only after she sat down did the cafe owner whisper aggressively, You paid for her again, David. That's coming out of your tips. It is just coffee, David murmured, looking down at his burnt fingers from a faulty espresso steam pipe. He didn't complain. Outside, a sleek black luxury sedan pulled up directly against the cold, frosty curb. Sihua stepped out. Having spent hours tracking him down through local photography archives, she stared through the glass window. There he was. He was not holding an expensive professional camera anymore. Instead, he was busy making perfect warm lattes, his face pale with exhaustion. What kind of photographer works a coffee machine? She whispered to herself. Her bodyguard stepped forward instantly. Should I fetch him out, CEO Han? No, she stopped him, her breath fogging in the winter air. I will go inside alone. A small doorbell chimed beautifully as she walked inside. David looked up, his eyes locking with hers. The sudden appearance of Seoul's most discussed CEO didn't make him smile triumphantly. Instead, his shoulders dropped slightly, and he let out a long, quiet breath. The emotional uncertainty between them tightened instantly, leaving both of them completely unsure of what the other wanted. David did not offer a grand greeting. He simply wiped down the counter with a clean cloth. The quiet silence between them grew heavy. Guests at nearby tables noticed Sihua's expensive tailored coat and began whispering into their phones. Why are you here, CEO Han? David asked softly. Sihua stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the cheap wooden floorboards. You lost your photography job because of me. I don't like owing debts. She placed a thick white envelope on the counter. Inside was enough cash to pay his rent for a year. Take this. Consider it compensation. David looked down at the money. A bitter, weary smile touched his lips, but it vanished instantly. He felt deeply lonely in this cold city, but his dignity wasn't for sale. He pushed the envelope back toward her. I didn't save that little girl for your money, he said, his voice dropping an octave. And I didn't offer you that cloth to get a payout. Sihua's eyes narrowed. Decades of corporate betrayal had taught her that everyone had a price. Everyone wants something, Mr. David. Don't act superior. You need this money. Do need money, David admitted openly, his eyes dropping to his scarred hands. But I don't need charity from someone who uses cash to hide her own pain. The words hit like a physical slap. Sihua flinched, her corporate wall cracking for a brief second. She felt a sudden surge of anger, misreading his honesty as arrogance. You know nothing about my pain. Then leave the cafe, David said quietly, turning back to the espresso machine. He didn't see the tiny tremor in her fingers as she snatched the envelope back. She spun around and walked out, the bell chiming aggressively behind her. But as she reached her car, a sudden realization stopped her. In her anger, she had left her expensive, custom-made notebook on the counter, the one containing her private schedules and her father's final company directives. Inside the cafe, David picked up the notebook. He didn't open it. He just sighed, rubbing his aching temples. He was exhausted. He had missed his morning shift at the community clinic where he volunteered, and the cafe owner was already glinting at him with annoyance. Helping people always cost him. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. It was an international call from Nigeria. His heart leaped into his throat, a sudden wave of fear washing over him. "Hello, Mom," he answered quickly, stepping into the back alley. "David, my son." His mother's voice sounded weak, breathing heavily through the static. "Did you manage to send the extra funds for the clinic bill this month? The doctors are asking." David's chest tightened with intense guilt. He had just lost his main photography contract because of the Gala incident, and he had rejected Sihua's money. He couldn't tell his mother the truth. It would break her heart. "Yes, Mom," David lied, tears blurring his eyes in the dark alleyway. "Don't worry about the money. I am working a major project tonight. The funds will clear tomorrow. Just focus on resting." "Thank God," she whispered. "I love you, son." The line went dead. David leaned his head against the cold brick wall, closing his eyes tightly. One silent tear slipped down his dark cheek. He was completely broke, his mother was suffering, and he had just turned down a small fortune out of pride. He felt the crushing weight of his own choices. He walked back inside, grabbed Siwa's notebook, and made a decision. He would return it to her office personally. Not for a reward, but because it was the right thing to do. 2 hours later, David stood in the grand lobby of Han Global. The security guards immediately blocked his path, scanning his simple clothes with obvious disdain. "You can't be here," the head guard said roughly, pushing David back. "I'm just returning something to CEO Han," David explained, holding up the notebook. The guard grabbed David's wrist aggressively, twisting it slightly. David winced as the pressure aggravated the burn on his finger from earlier. "Hand it over and get out before we call the police." Him through. A sharp voice cut through the lobby. Sihua walked out of the private elevator, surrounded by 3 assistant managers. She looked at David's bruised hand, then at the notebook. A wave of guilt washed over her, but she masked it instantly with a cold expression. "Come up to my office," she commanded. Inside the massive executive suite, David placed the notebook on her desk. "You forgot this." Sihua looked at him, noticing the raw redness on his wrist where the guard had grabbed him. He had suffered just to bring her property back. Her defensive walls began to struggle against her human vulnerability. "Why didn't you just leave it at the desk?" she asked, her voice softer now. "Why come all this way when you clearly dislike me?" "I don't dislike you, CEO Han," David said, his breathing stabilizing. "I just think you are lonely, and I know what loneliness feels like." They stood inches apart. The air became thick with an unsaid emotional tension. For a split second, David's hand brushed against hers as he turned to leave. A sudden spark of awareness passed between them. It was an almost touch that made both of their hearts skip a beat, an unscripted moment of pure emotional uncertainty. "Wait," Sihua said, her voice catching in her throat. She almost asked him to stay, almost dropped her corporate guard completely. Instead, she hesitated. "My father's old study room has an antique wooden cabinet from the 1950s. It was damaged during the family dispute last week. The restorers said it's unfixable. You mentioned you have restoration skills on your old photography resume." David stopped. "I do. Fix it," she said, looking away to hide her racing thoughts. "I will pay you a professional fee, no charity, a strict business contract. Do we have a deal?" David looked at her profile. He knew he needed the money for his mother's clinic bills. He knew this would mean spending time near a woman who could destroy his peace of mind. But he had no choice. "We have a deal," David murmured. The private residence of Han Global's founding family was more of a fortress than a home. High stone walls shut out the rest of Seoul. Inside, the air smelled of expensive wax and cold polish. David carried his worn wooden toolbox into the grand study. His boots made a dull thudding sound against the thick Persian rugs. He felt entirely out of place, a solitary figure surrounded by generations of unearned wealth. In the corner of the room stood the cabinet. It was a massive piece of mid-century mahogany, its doors splintered and its brass handles twisted off. It had been violently kicked in during a frantic search for corporate documents by COA's desperate relatives. David knelt before the broken wood. He ran his fingers along the jagged edges, feeling the deep fractures. Can it be saved? Sia stood in the doorway. She had changed into a simple black sweater, her hair pulled back loosely. Without her sharp business suits, she looked smaller. Frail, almost. Everything can be saved, David said without looking up. It just takes time and patience. Time is a luxury we don't have, she murmured, stepping closer. My aunt is trying to use the missing documents from this cabinet to challenge my position at the board meeting next Tuesday. If I lose control of the board, my father's legacy is gone. David remained silent. He pulled out a small sanding block and began working on the rough edges. The rhythmic, soothing sound of sandpaper filled the tense room. He didn't offer a motivational speech. He just worked, his breathing calm and deliberate. Siwa watched his hands. Despite the fresh cuts from the Gala and the burn from the cafe machine, his movements were incredibly precise, gentle. Why do you do this? She asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the silence. You are a qualified doctor. Your resume mentioned your medical degree from Nigeria. Why are you working 3 dead-end jobs in a country that doesn't even recognize your license? David's hand froze for a fraction of a second. A deep, agonizing shadow crossed his eyes. The third invisible question, the wound he was desperately hiding, threatened to surface. He forced himself to resume sanding. In my village, we had a small clinic, David said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper. A heavy fever swept through the children. I had the medicine, but I was tired. I slept through a midnight knock on my door. When I woke up, it was too late for 2 of them. He stopped, his grip tightening on the sanding block until his knuckles turned white. I came here to earn enough to rebuild that clinic with proper staff. I don't deserve to practice medicine until I pay that debt. Siwa felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She had assumed he was just another migrant worker seeking fortune. Instead, she was looking at a man crushing himself under the weight of an unbearable survivor's guilt. It wasn't your fault, she said softly. It was, David replied bluntly, looking her straight in the eyes. Just like it isn't your fault your family is greedy. But you still carry the weight, don't you? Siwa stepped back, stunned by his directness. She wanted to snap at him to protect herself with her usual corporate arrogance, but she couldn't. For the first time in her life, someone had seen right through her expensive armor. Suddenly, the heavy double doors of the study flew open. Siwa's ex-fiancé, Choi Jinwoo, strode into the room, flanked by 2 lawyers. He wore an immaculate gray suit and an arrogant smirk that made David's jaw tighten. Still playing with broken toys, Siwa, Jinwoo mocked, glaring at the damaged cabinet. Then he noticed David kneeling on the floor. His eyes flared with immediate disgust. What is this trash doing in your father's house? Queens, this is the moment everything changes. Siwa stepped between Jinwoo and David, her eyes flashing with dangerous corporate fire. He is an expert restorer under private contract. Leave my house, Jinwoo. I am leaving. Jinwoo laughed coldly, tossing a legal document onto the mahogany desk. But take a look at that first. Your aunt just transferred 30% of her shares to my family's firm. By Tuesday morning, I will have the majority vote. You have 4 days to pack your things, CEO Han. Siwa reached for the paper, her hand shaking violently. She read the signatures, her face turning entirely pale. The corporate survival she had sacrificed her entire life for was crumbling in front of her. Jinwoo leaned in close, whispering maliciously, You should have married me. Now you have absolutely nothing. He turned on his heel and marched out, his lawyers following closely. The heavy silence returned, heavier than before. Siwa stood frozen, staring at the document. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps. The pressure of decades of emotional neglect and conditional affection finally broke her down. She dropped to her knees, the paper slipping from her fingers. She didn't cry out loud. She just stared at the floor, her shoulders trembling violently as the silent tears finally spilled over. David didn't move away. He didn't offer useless words of comfort. He quietly set down his tools and slid across the floor, sitting beside her on the cold rug. He didn't try to hug her. He simply placed his large, scarred hand flat on the floor, an inch away from her trembling fingers. An almost moment of absolute vulnerability, Siwa looked at his hand. For the first time, she didn't reject the silent support. She slowly moved her hand forward until her pinky finger gently brushed against his. That tiny, hesitant touch felt more powerful than a physical embrace. I have nowhere left to go, she whispered, her voice completely broken. You are still standing, David said softly, his voice a steady anchor in her storm. The cabinet isn't finished yet, and neither are you. What do you think of David's silent strength? Let us know in the comments below if you think Siwa will find the courage to fight back alongside him. Suddenly, David's eyes caught a glint of reflective silver inside the dark, exposed cavity of the broken cabinet wall. While sanding the deepest corner, the vibration had loosened a false backing panel. He reached in slowly, his fingers brushing against a thick, sealed parchment envelope hidden deep within the old wood. David pulled the sealed parchment envelope from the hidden compartment. The thick paper bore the official golden seal of Han Global's founding chairman. Siwa stared at it, her breath catching in her throat as she recognized her father's elegant, precise handwriting on the front. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "It was hidden behind the main support beam," David said, his voice steady as he handed it to her. "Your father didn't want it found by accident. He wanted it found by someone who cared enough to look deep inside." Siwa tore the envelope open with shaking fingers. Inside lay the original, handwritten declaration of trust, the missing piece of the corporate puzzle. It explicitly stated that 35% of the company's core voting shares were locked in an untouchable family trust, solely manageable by Siwa, completely independent of any board maneuvers or third-party transfers. Her aunt's illegal share transfer to Jinwoo was completely invalid. "It's here," Siwa breathed, a sudden wave of immense relief washing over her face. "Everything I needed to protect his legacy, it was here all along." She looked up at David, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and profound realization. Coincidence had given her the clue, but it was David's tireless, deliberate labor that had actually uncovered the truth. "You found it," she said, her voice dropping into an intimate whisper. "You saved me again." "Only fixed the wood," David replied with a quiet, humble smile. "The truth was always yours." He stood up to pack his tools, but the sudden movement caused him to lose his balance. He stumbled slightly, a sharp groan escaping his lips as he gripped his side. Siwa was by his side instantly, her corporate defenses completely forgotten. She reached out, her hands resting firmly against his chest to steady him. "David, what is it?" "What's wrong?" "It is nothing," he muttered, trying to pull away, but his face had turned entirely pale. She pushed his jacket aside, noticing for the first time a heavy, dark blue bruise spreading across his ribs. It was from the charity gala. When he had thrown his body over the little girl to shield her from the exploding crystal sculpture, a heavy metal camera stand had crashed directly into his side. He had been walking around, working 3 grueling jobs and restoring her furniture while carrying a fractured rib without a single complaint. "You are hurt," Siwa said, her voice cracking with sudden, overwhelming emotion. "Why didn't you say anything? Every time you help someone, you destroy yourself." "Some things are worth the pain," David whispered, looking down at her. They stood incredibly close, their breath mingling in the quiet study. Siwa's hands remained on his chest, feeling the heavy, rapid thumping of his heart. David looked down at her lips. It was a breathless, almost moment, an electric, agonizing second where they both leaned in, almost crossing the professional line, almost letting their hidden scars heal in a single kiss. The loud, piercing chime of David's phone broke the spell. He stepped back awkwardly, clearing his throat as he answered the call. Within seconds, his expression completely changed. The color drained from his face, and his hand began to shake violently. David choked out into the receiver. "When did this happen?" The voice on the other end belonged to his mother's neighbor in Nigeria. The local clinic had abruptly cut off her medical treatments because the extra funds David promised hadn't cleared in time. His mother had collapsed from the heavy fever, and she was currently in critical condition. "I will send it now," David panicked, his voice breaking as tears filled his eyes. "Please tell the doctors I am sending the money right this second." He hung up, frantically opening his mobile banking app. His balance was completely empty. The money from the cafe wasn't due until next week, and he hadn't invoiced Siwa for the restoration work yet. The consequence of his pride and his constant sacrifices had finally come back to crush the person he loved most. "David, what's happening?" Siwa asked, her heart breaking at the sight of his raw panic. "My mother," David cried openly, completely unable to maintain his invincible persona. He dropped to his knees, burying his face in his scarred hands. "She's dying because of me. I spent all my money helping others, and I couldn't even save my own mother." Siwa didn't hesitate. She knelt right beside him, pulling his hands away from his face. "Give me your banking details, right now." "No, I cannot take your charity." "This isn't charity, David," she shouted, her voice thick with determination. "This is your payment for saving my father's company. This is your payment for saving my life. Let me help you." Without waiting for his permission, she snatched his phone, copied the bank routing details, and made an immediate, high-priority international wire transfer from her personal account. Within 3 minutes, the funds were cleared. David stared at the confirmation screen, his breathing heavy and ragged. The immediate danger was gone, but the emotional cost was devastating. He felt completely exposed, broken, and entirely dependent on the woman he was desperately trying not to fall in love with. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracking as he looked away in deep shame. "Look away from me, David," Siwa said softly, her fingers gently touching his chin to turn his face back to hers. "You don't have to carry the whole world alone anymore." The morning of the extraordinary board meeting arrived like an execution date. The grand boardroom of Han Global was a sea of dark suits and grim expressions. Choi Jinwoo sat at the end of the long mahogany table, a triumphant grin plastered across his face. "Paperwork is fully filed," Jinwoo announced, sliding a copy of the share transfer toward the elderly board members. "Han Global needs a firm hand, not emotional attachment to a dying man's legacy. It is time to vote CEO Han out." Board members exchanged looks, staying entirely silent. They valued profits over compassion, genuinely believing that corporate stability required this ruthless sacrifice. Suddenly, the heavy double doors swung open. Han Siwa walked in. She wasn't wearing her usual pale, defensive expression. She walked with absolute authority, her heels clicking like a countdown. Behind her, carrying a leather briefcase despite the visible stiffness in his injured ribs, walked David. "This meeting is officially adjourned," Siwa said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. Jinwoo laughed loudly, leaning back in his chair. "You don't have the authority anymore, Siwa. Your aunt's 30% belongs to my family now." "My aunt transferred shares she never truly owned," Siwa replied calmly. She nodded to David. Without a word, David stepped forward, his movements deliberate. He opened the briefcase and placed the original handwritten declaration of trust directly in front of the head legal counsel. The counsel adjusted his glasses, his eyes widening in complete shock as he read the golden-sealed parchment. This is the founding chairman's absolute directive. The core 35% of voting shares are legally locked. They cannot be transferred, sold, or used against CEO Han's explicit consent." Boardroom erupted into sudden, chaotic murmurs. Jinwoo's face turned completely purple. He jumped to his feet, knocking his chair backward. "This is a fake. Where did you even find this trash?" "It was found exactly where my father hid it," Siwa said, looking directly into Jinwoo's panicked eyes. "Behind the broken promises your family tried to steal." Jinwoo spun around, pointing a trembling finger at David. You ruined this. A worthless, illegal migrant photographer entering a high-level corporate dispute. Security. Throw this man out of the building immediately." 2 heavy guards stepped into the room, moving aggressively toward David. David didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his chin held high, though his breath caught slightly as his fractured rib throbbed with intense pain. He didn't offer a dramatic speech or try to fight back. He simply stood by Siwa's side, a silent, resilient shield. "Touch him," Siwa warned, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "and I will file personal criminal trespassing and assault charges against every single person in this room. This man is my official, privately contracted legal consultant. He stays right here." Guards froze, looking nervously at the board members. The board members quickly shook their heads, completely withdrawing their support from Jinwoo as they realized where the true power lay. Jinwoo realized he had lost completely. He grabbed his papers, glaring at David with pure, unadulterated hatred. "You think you've won? You're nothing but a temporary shadow in her world, Doctor. Let's see how long a billionaire keeps you around once the dust settles." He stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The board meeting ended in a swift, unanimous vote confirming Siwa's absolute authority. The shareholders offered their fake congratulations, rushing to shake her hand, but Siwa ignored them all. The moment the room cleared, she turned around to look for David. He was gone. He had quietly slipped out during the chaos of the handshakes, leaving the leather briefcase on the table. He didn't want the corporate praise. He didn't want to stand in her spotlight. Siwa ran out into the executive hallway, her heart pounding frantically against her ribs. She searched the elevators. Empty. She ran down to the grand lobby, her eyes scanning the crowds of employees. There he was. He was walking out of the glass revolving doors, his old camera bag slung over his shoulder, his posture slightly hunched from the pain in his side. "David," she called out, running through the lobby, entirely ignoring the shocked stares of her employees. David stopped on the snowy pavement outside, turning back slowly. The winter wind blew between them, scattering white flakes across his dark jacket. "Why did you leave?" she asked, her breath fogging heavily in the freezing air. "The victory belongs to you too." "You earned this. The victory belongs to your father's legacy, Siwa," David said softly, a tired, beautiful smile touching his lips. "My job is done. The cabinet is fully restored. Your company is fully safe." "And what about us?" The words escaped her lips before she could stop them. Her corporate walls were completely gone, leaving only her raw human vulnerability. David's smile dipped, a flash of profound loneliness crossing his warm brown eyes. He stepped closer, his hand hovering in the air between them, an almost moment of absolute heartbreak. He almost reached out to wipe a stray snowflake from her cheek. He almost told her that he had fallen deeply in love with her. Instead, his phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a confirmation text from the medical clinic in Nigeria. His mother's condition had fully stabilized, and she was being moved to a private recovery room thanks to Siwa's transfer. "My mother is safe now because of you," David said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I have to go back home, Siwa. My flight leaves tonight. I have a clinic to rebuild." The words hung in the freezing air like ice. David stood under the gray Seoul sky, his camera bag feeling heavier than ever. He had spent years dreaming of this exact moment, returning home to rebuild his village clinic. Yet looking at Siwa, his feet felt glued to the frozen pavement. "Tonight," Siwa whispered. Her voice cracked, the sound instantly swallowed by the cold wind. "You're leaving tonight." David didn't speak. He couldn't. He simply nodded, his eyes fixed on hers, memorizing every line of her face. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his old vintage camera strap. The tiny wooden baobab tree charm swung gently between them. He held it out to her. "Keep this," he said, his voice dropping to a low, rough whisper. "To remind you that roots don't break in the storm." Siwa reached out, her fingers brushing against his warm hand for a final, agonizing second. It was an almost moment, almost holding on, almost begging him to drop the bag and stay in her world. She couldn't bring herself to say it. She knew what his dream cost him. She knew the lives waiting for him in Lagos. "Thank you, David," she murmured, closing her hand around the small wooden tree. David offered one last, quiet bow, turned around, and walked toward the subway stairs. He didn't look back. Every step aggravated his fractured rib, but the physical pain was absolutely nothing compared to the hollow ache opening up in his chest. He was a doctor who could heal everyone except himself. 3 hours later, Siwa sat alone in her massive, dark executive office. The documents confirming her absolute victory over the board sat on her desk, untouched. The silence was suffocating. She looked down at the tiny baobab charm in her palm, her heart tightening under immense psychological stress. Suddenly, her personal secretary rushed into the room without knocking. "CEO Han, you need to see this. We were archive clearing the old corporate database from your father's private server, and we found a locked security file from 14 years ago." "I don't care about files right now," Siwa said coldly. "Ma'am, it's about the factory fire," the secretary insisted, placing a digital tablet on the desk. "The night you were saved." Siwa's eyes locked on the screen. The video flickered to life. It was a chaotic news broadcast from a freezing winter night over a decade ago. Smoke and fire poured from a collapsed warehouse. While a crowd of terrified onlookers stood back, filming on their phones, a young teenage boy ran directly into the raging flames. He was a young Nigerian exchange student, wearing a faded school uniform. He didn't hesitate. He smashed the side window of an overturned vehicle with his bare hands, crawled inside, and dragged an unconscious, bleeding Korean girl out of the inferno. The camera zoomed in on his face as he collapsed on the snow, his hands bleeding heavily as he shielded the girl from the freezing wind. Around his neck, swinging loosely from a school lanyard, was the exact same wooden baobab tree charm. The girl on the screen was a young Han Siwa. David had saved her life 14 years ago. He had carried the memory of her survival through every grueling shift, every broken camera, and every quiet sacrifice in Seoul. He had never told her. He hadn't wanted her billions, her gratitude, or her contracts. He had simply wanted to ensure the girl he saved all those years ago was finally safe from the storms of life. A fresh wave of hot tears rushed down her face. True wealth wasn't what she owned. It was the life she had been given by a boy who bled for her in the snow. The car. Siwa slammed her hands on the desk, her voice exploding with fierce determination. Now, ma'am. Where are we going? Incheon Airport, she shouted, sprinting toward the private elevator. Drive like my life depends on it, because it does. Queens, come closer, this is the moment everything finally changes. The luxury sedan tore through the snowy highway, the tires screeching against the slush. Siwa stared at the digital clock on the dashboard. 8:45 p.m. David's flight to Lagos was scheduled to board at exactly 9. Faster, she urged the driver, her hands shaking violently as she gripped the leather seats. Please, just go faster. Every 30 seconds felt like an eternity. She opened her phone, frantically dialing his number over and over again. The number you have dialed is currently unavailable. When the car slammed to a halt outside Terminal 1, Siwa didn't wait for the bodyguard to open her door. She threw herself out into the freezing air, her expensive heels clicking frantically against the concrete as she sprinted into the bustling, massive terminal. She ran past the check-in counters, her eyes scanning the sea of travelers. She checked the departure screens. The gate for the Lagos flight was already flashing red. Asterisk boarding. Asterisk, she ran toward the high-security international departures gate, but two heavy airport security officers immediately stepped forward, blocking her path. Ma'am, you cannot pass without an international boarding pass. Me through, Siwa screamed, entirely losing her corporate composure, tears streaming openly down her face. The man I love is on that plane. I need to see him. David. Her voice echoed through the massive glass terminal, but it was too late. The heavy security doors slid shut, separating her from the gates. She collapsed against the glass wall, her breath fogging the cold pain, completely heartbroken as she realized she had lost the only person who had ever truly protected her soul. The terminal lights blurred through her tears. Siwa slid down the cold glass partition, holding the tiny baobab charm tightly against her chest. She had all the power in the world, yet she couldn't stop the one person who mattered from walking away. Siwa. A deep, smooth, familiar accent cut through the loud airport announcements. She froze. She slowly raised her head. David stood 10 feet away, holding a paper cup of warm tea. His heavy flight bag sat on the floor beside his boots. He wasn't behind the security gates. He hadn't boarded the plane. David. She scrambled to her feet, her voice cracking completely. Why? Why aren't you on the flight? David took a slow step forward, a warm, vulnerable smile breaking across his tired face. I reached the gate, I looked at the ticket, but then I looked at my hands. He held up his scarred fingers. The cuts from the glass are fully healed. The burn from the cafe is gone, but my heart was still trapped in Seoul. I realized I couldn't rebuild a clinic to save lives back home when I was leaving my own life behind with you. Siwa didn't hesitate. She threw her arms around his neck, burying her face into his shoulder. She sobbed openly, her shoulders shaking violently as decades of emotional neglect, loneliness, and corporate trauma completely melted away in his embrace. David wrapped his large arms around her, holding her tightly against his chest, completely unbothered by his throbbing fractured rib. He buried his face in her hair, letting out a long, shuddering breath. The long delay was finally over. The emotional gratification was fully earned through years of silent sacrifice. Know about the fire, David, she whispered into his neck, crying tears of pure relief. You saved me 14 years ago. Why didn't you tell me? David pulled back slightly, his gentle brown eyes locking onto hers with absolute sincerity. I didn't save you so you would owe me a corporate debt, Siwa. I saved you because you were a beautiful soul who deserved to live. I would run into those flames 1,000 times more just to see you standing here today. They stood in the middle of the bustling international terminal, completely locked in their own world. David slowly leaned down, his lips gently brushing against hers. It wasn't a rushed, frantic movement. It was a beautiful, quiet, and deeply emotional kiss that finally answered every almost moment they had shared in the dark. Come home with me first, Siwa murmured against his lips, her hands cupping his face. Let's build that clinic together in Nigeria. Han Global will fund the entire project, but you are going to run it as chief medical officer. Your license will be fully recognized there, and I will be right by your side. David stared at her, his eyes shining with profound emotion as his ultimate dream and his true love finally aligned. Together, together, she promised firmly. True love doesn't demand you to change your destination. It simply walks the long, challenging road right beside you until you are both finally home. They walked out of the terminal hand in hand, stepping into the falling snow. The winter wind was still cold, but as David pulled her close against his side, they both knew the freezing storm had finally passed. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. What moment stayed with you the most? Tell me in the comments. And if this story found a place in your heart, subscribe and join us for the next unforgettable journey.